7 days before my wedding, I received a text that split my world into two halves, before and after. It was a Photomy bride-to-be kissing my brother. Below it, she wrote 4 words that hollowed me out from the inside: "Change of plans, my groom now." My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, but instead of rage or despair, a strange calm washed over me. I replied with nothing but heart emojis. And in that silence, I began laying the foundation for the most devastating revenge plan of my life. The wedding countdown had been a blur of preparations. Everyone around me was buzzing with excitement, relatives finalizing travel plans, vendors calling with confirmations, my parents running between venues and decorators like generals commanding a war effort. My phone was a constant explosion of notifications, friends joking in group chats, cousins sharing nostalgic photos, and her sending me updates about flower arrangements, her dress, and guest lists. To the outside world, I was a man on the verge of a perfect new chapter. In reality, I was already drowning in the pressure of expectations, and though I would never admit it then, I had been suppressing doubts that gnawed at me in quiet moments. Something about her had always felt slippery. Not dishonest outright, but like a shadow that shifted depending on the light. I convinced myself it was just nerves, the natural anxiety of committing your life to another person. That illusion shattered in an instant. The message arrived when I was sitting at my desk late at night, scrolling mindlessly through emails. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The photo was unmistakable, her lips pressed against my brother's, her arms curled around his neck with the same tenderness I had once thought was mine alone. His face's mug, triumphant, was tilted just enough that there was no room for doubt. And beneath it, the words, "Change of plans, my groom now." I didn't scream. I didn't throw my phone across the room. I didn't even call her. Instead, I typed out 3 red heart emojis, hit send, and set the phone down on the table as though it were an ordinary conversation. My chest was tight, but my mind felt sharper than it had in months. It was almost comical, the way betrayal clarified everything. The wedding was no longer a celebration, it was a stage. And I realized in that moment, I held the power to script the final act. The first thought that crossed my mind was humiliation. They thought they had humiliated me by blindsiding me with this change of plans. They thought I would fall apart, cancel everything, crawl into a corner, and watch them walk away together while my family whispered about how I'd been broken. No. That wasn't going to happen. I didn't know the exact shape of my revenge yet, but I knew it had to be devastating, precise, and unforgettable. Something that would leave them haunted every time they thought of me. So, I began to plan. The next morning, I went about my routine as if nothing had happened. At breakfast, my brother sat across the table from me, his face composed, though his eyes darted toward me once or twice as if he was testing whether I knew. If he was waiting for me to confront him, he would be waiting forever. I buttered my toast, sipped my coffee, and asked him about his work, as though I hadn't seen him locked in an embrace with my fiancée. Inside, I was cataloging every move. The way he smiled too easily, the way his shoulders relaxed when he realized I wasn't saying anything, it all fueled the fire in my chest. Betrayal by a stranger is painful. Betrayal by blood is something else entirely. Throughout the day, I let myself replay every interaction between the two of them in the past year, seeing the puzzle pieces I had ignored before. Her subtle laughter at his jokes, the way he always volunteered to help her carry things, the occasional glance they exchanged when they thought no one was watching. How could I have been so blind? The answer, I realized, was simple: love makes fools of us all. But I was done being a fool. That afternoon, I called the wedding planner. My voice was steady, even cheerful, as I confirmed that everything was on track. Guest count? Still the same. Menu? Perfect. Venue decorations? Proceed as planned. I gave no indication that the bride had switched grooms. Let them think I was blissfully unaware, still preparing to stand at the altar. Because when the day arrived, I wanted the stage to be full, the lights bright, and the audience ready. In the days that followed, I maintained my mask. Friends and family continued to shower me with congratulations, and I played my part, smiling, laughing, nodding, and pretending I couldn't wait for the big day. Meanwhile, I was engineering my revenge in silence. I started small. First, I made a duplicate of the wedding guest list. As I looked over the names, I realized how powerful it would be for everyone to witness the truth at the same time. Betrayal is one thing in private, it festers quietly, hidden from the world. But betrayal exposed under the gaze of family, friends, and colleagues? That's a scar that never fades. Next, I reached out to a photographer friend, someone I trusted implicitly. I asked him to print and frame a particular photo, enlarging it to a size that would make it impossible to miss. Of course, it wasn't the engagement photo everyone expected to see at the reception. It was the one she had sent me, her lips on my brother's, her betrayal immortalized in glossy high resolution. The friend didn't ask questions. He just nodded grimly, and I knew he understood. At night, lying awake in bed, I began rehearsing the words I would say. It wasn't enough to simply expose them, I wanted to crush them with elegance, to turn what they thought was a triumph into their most humiliating downfall. But revenge, I told myself, had to be savored slowly. If I rushed it, I risked losing control. And control was everything. 3 days before the wedding, she called me. Her voice was soft, careful, almost guilty, as if she suspected that I knew. "How are you feeling?" she asked. I forced a smile into my voice. "Excited. Counting down the days." There was a pause, then a small laugh. "Me too." I could picture her, biting her lip, glancing around to make sure my brother wasn't listening in. Maybe she wondered if I had seen the photo, if my silence was a trap. But she didn't dare ask. And I didn't give her the satisfaction of showing weakness. When we hung up, I sat there staring at my phone, my chest tight with a mix of fury and dark amusement. She thought she had me wrapped around her finger. She thought she could betray me, steal my brother, and still play the role of the blushing bride. The arrogance was almost admirable. But soon, she would understand what it felt like to be stripped bare in front of everyone you know. The night before the wedding, I barely slept. Not out of nerves, but anticipation. I had spent the week constructing a facade so convincing that no one suspected a thing. I was calm, collected, smiling at every family member who asked if I was nervous. My parents beamed with pride, blissfully unaware that their sons were caught in a betrayal that would shake them to the core. And as I lay awake in the darkness, I repeated the plan in my head like a mantra. Tomorrow, I wouldn't just confront them. I would destroy them. I didn't want screaming. I didn't want a scene of chaos that could later be dismissed as a bad breakup. No, I wanted precision. I wanted theater. I wanted the kind of devastation that left no room for excuses, the kind of silence that follows when the truth hits harder than any shouted accusation. Tomorrow, under the bright lights, with every guest watching, they would be unmasked. And I would stand not as the victim, but as the architect of their downfall. For the first time since receiving that photo, I closed my eyes and smiled. The next morning the house smelled like coffee and fresh flowers, decor left over from the rehearsal, delicate arrangements that someone else would later call elegant, while they whispered about the drama. I moved through the rooms with the same calm I had rehearsed, but underneath that calm my mind charted a path entirely different from the one anyone expected. The wedding, which had been meant to be a personal union, had become a weapon in a larger battle that involved legacy, money, and power. Our family business had been a slow, stubborn machine for decades, an empire built on contracts, favors, and a reputation for being unflinchingly ruthless when it came to deals. My father had built it with a discipline that bordered on obsession, and our household had echoed with talk of spreadsheets and negotiations more than lullabies. I had learned early that public sentiment was a tool and appearance was leverage. Weddings were public, and public moments carried reach. That truth had crystallized the second I received the photo. This betrayal was not going to be an intimate wound I nursed in private. I could either watch it fracture my house or use it to revise the structure of power in my favor. Because power isn't just about who holds titles. It's about who gets to rewrite the story. By noon I had activated the first layer of my plan. I called the senior partner who handled PR for the company, someone I trusted because his loyalty was always transactional and therefore predictable. He came over under the guise of delivering last-minute corporate wedding gifts, but really he was the man who would do the dirty work that needed to look like an accident. "Everything okay?" he asked, sipping my coffee with the careless air of a man who had seen many crises and placed bets on which ones were profitable. I placed a framed print on the table, the enlargement of the photo she'd sent. He glanced at it and then slowly set his cup down. "This is explosive," he said. "If it goes public before the wedding." "It will go public," I interrupted, and my voice was cool as a scalpel. "But not in the way you think." I explained what I needed, a narrative that would spin the betrayal into a clean line that exposed not only the lovers but the structural cracks in the family's succession plans. I wanted the board and the investment partners to question loyalties, to see how fractured alliances had become, and to recognize that only one person was prepared to stabilize the company. I wanted people to doubt my brother's capacity for stewardship. I wanted our stakeholders to feel fear enough to let me collect the reins. He nodded slowly. "So public exposure, but crafted something that triggers a loyalty realignment." "Exactly," I said. "Make it impossible for them to ignore the elephant in the room without looking complicit." We scheduled a meeting the week after the wedding, real enough to be plausible. I would need to present myself as the grieving fiancé who refused to be clouded by emotion when it came to the business. I would play the part of the rational pillar, the man the executives could rely on. But first, the honeymoon of humiliation had to play out in full. My brother walked around the house that afternoon as if he owned the air in every room, his swagger retooled into the triumphant gait of a man who had cheated the system and won. He assumed I would crumble, and that conceit made him careless. He made calls loudly, he joked in front of family, he held court in the living room like a king surveying his spoils. I catalogued every boast, every smug glance, committing them to memory. These would be useful later when I needed to remind people that arrogance precedes collapse. By evening, I had begun to seed the external narrative. I arranged a quiet dinner with two influential people from the board, one of them an old investor with a temperament like a loaded gun, and the other a woman who ran a rival branch and watched for signs of weakness like a hawk. They thought the dinner was a pre-wedding celebration. They left convinced that I was carrying grief at arm's length but had the clarity to stabilize operations. I hinted, carefully, at potential leadership gaps, how personal decisions could bleed into professional responsibilities. The investor leaned in. "You'll need to be ready," he said, almost kindly. "If there's any doubt about leadership." "I'll provide certainty," I replied, and that promise settled in both of them like credit deposited into a bank. Their shift in posture was exactly the leverage I needed. That night, as the house settled into a lullaby of distant laughter and clinking glasses from the rehearsal dinner, I opened my laptop and drafted memos. They were dry, corporate, and mercilessly efficient. Contingency measures, one header read. Succession clarity, another. I copied the board, blind copied the investor who loved to be in every loop, and attached a brief, carefully phrased note about the need for an emergency meeting to discuss strategic stability. It was the kind of move that in corporate terms meant the illness was not in the company's balance sheet but in the leadership structure. Then I waited. The waiting was another knife. People hate to be rushed when power is at stake, yet they also fear appearing incompetent. Within hours the memos had been acknowledged. The investor called my father directly. The board began to stir, the currents of corporate worry starting to ripple outward. My father, who had always prided himself on being the first to sense danger, called me in the middle of the night. "Are you all right?" he asked, voice rough with concern. "Yes," I said, and I could hear him relax for a moment. Then, carefully, I seeded the doubt. "There are complications," I said. "It's messy. I think we should firm up the plan to avoid any gap." I let the unsaid words linger, a hint that personal dynamics were infecting decision-making. By morning, the board wanted a meeting. My brother, who had not yet been formally inducted into the operational leadership he assumed awaited him, now found himself at the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. He tried to pivot, to charm and explain, but charm alone does not fortify a sinking ship. I was playing a long game. In the short term, the photo would humiliate them. In the medium term, the corporate moves would bleed them financially and politically. In the long term, I would consolidate control and secure not just my position but the narrative of competence. People remember who steadied the helm in crises, not who celebrated early victories. The wedding day arrived with a heavy, electric sky. Guests streamed into the venue, dressed in silk and strategy. Conversations flowed like currency, alliances rekindled, gossip traded like stocks. My parents floated through the crowd like diplomats, their faces were polished with pride and oblivion. She moved through the room like a practiced performer, letting people admire her as though the affair were a triumph triptych. My brother smiled wider than necessary and lingered at every opportunity. At the ceremony, I walked down the aisle with the air of a man consenting to an irreversible life choice, though in truth the choice had been reconfigured into a transaction. I watched her as we exchanged vows, words that would have once meant everything. I heard them echo through the hall and felt them clatter against each other like glass. When she slipped the ring on my finger, the audience applauded and music swelled. My body was present, my mind was conducting. I knew that the reveal had to be dramatic but measured. Too much spectacle risked reducing me to a soap opera villain, too little and they would call the event a private squabble. So I employed a third force, silence. When the time came for the speeches, I rose. The room hushed, an ocean of expectancy. I had a speech written, something that would appear as though it came from the heart, but beneath it a message that would unspool carefully, like a surgeon's incision. My voice was steady, and I began with gratitude, because everyone expects gratitude at weddings. I spoke about family, about the strange alchemy that turns two people into a single force. I spoke of trust. Then, pivoting like an expert chess player, I started to weave in the cautionary lines about integrity and transparency. I believe, I said, that personal actions have professional consequences. Power demands responsibility, and when responsibility is fractured by dishonesty, the entire structure risks collapse. A few gasps fluttered. She froze. My brother's jaw tightened. I let the silence sit like a living thing, tasting it before I dealt the next card. We've built something remarkable together, I continued. And it's my duty to ensure that nothing, no matter how personal, jeopardizes the future of what so many have worked for. The investor-eyed fed crumbs to sat forward, attentive. The rival executive's eyes gleamed with opportunistic curiosity. My father's face, at first unreadable, showed a microphone of worry. This was the pivot point. I stopped speaking as the murmurs began to rise. Then, quietly, I asked the coordinator to display a video montage, something we had used to celebrate the company at earlier events. The screen flickered to life, and for a moment, before anyone comprehended the content, wedding photos danced across the display. Laughter rose, then folded into confused murmurs when the montage included a photograph that did not belong to our curated album. The image filled the screen, her and my brother, kissing. It is hard to describe the way laughter curdles into silence, the emotional equivalent of a car skidding across ice. I watched their faces change, the smooth amusement curdling into shame and horror. She looked as if the carpet had been pulled from beneath her feet. My brother's face, usually so composed, went a pale green. The room had shifted. What was private had become corporate weather. People asked questions, then soft at first, then sharper, as if the photo had unlocked a dam of curiosity and moral indignation. Whispered exchanges became accusations. My father's voice, when he finally spoke, was small and brittle. "Explain," he said. I did not shout. I did not cry. I spoke as if reading minutes from a board meeting, objective, procedural, and damning. I described a breach of trust, not as an intimate betrayal but as a failure of stewardship, someone who had allowed personal impulses to override responsibilities, someone whose judgment could no longer be trusted with the future of the company. I outlined the need for an interim assessment, the convening of a governance committee, and the immediate suspension of any pending operational authorizations. By the time the last syllable left my mouth, the room was not angry at me. It was aligning. People sought the stability that I offered, and in that seeking, they paved the way for my ascendancy. The humiliation was surgical. It did not involve shouting or shaming in vulgar terms, it involved the application of cold logic in a moment of public exposure. What had been an intimate betrayal had been converted into a corporate crisis, and the board, always allergic to risk, moved as one to contain it. My brother, who had been on the cusp of inclusion in the executive circle, watched as the doors he had expected to open now closed on him. She watched too, her plan of marrying into power imploding under the weight of publicity. But power is cunning. It rarely disappears without leaving residues. My father, who revered order, was shaken not only by his son's moral failures but by the implication that the family's reputation, its currency, was now compromised. He turned to me with a look I had not seen since childhood. Equal parts hunger and assessment. This was the crucial moment. Would he retreat to protect the family brand, or would he pass the torch to the steady hand he trusted? He stayed silent for a long second, then nodded slowly. The board convened, words like governance, conflict of interest, and interim leadership folded into the conversation. They appointed a small committee to investigate, and asked me to serve as interim steward until the matter was resolved. I accepted, speaking in measured tones about repairing trust. In truth, I had designed every step to bring us here. When the dust settled, if dust ever truly settles in a house of power, my brother had retreated from the center. He moved through the house in the following days like a man who had lost membership in a secret club. She disappeared from social feeds, and when she did appear, her face was guarded and raw. My parents oscillated between disbelief and damage control, their loyalty split between sons and the business. The investors' calls increased, the rival executive started to make small, pointed suggestions about restructuring. Power, in its slow and patient way, sniffed out opportunity and began its subtle colonization. I had wanted devastation for them, yes, but I had also wanted a consolidation. I intended to hold the line and guide the company through the storm that had originated in our house and then spread outward. That consolidation meant appointments, reassignment of responsibilities, and a reshuffling that required not violence, but method. I made recommendations, a temporary redistribution of client-facing duties, an audit of accounts that could reveal conflict of interest vulnerabilities, and mandatory ethics training sessions. The language was sterile, corporate, but the practical effect was rebar in the foundation of my control. In private, late at night, I walked the house with the quiet feeling of a man who had exchanged his old life for one with a different kind of armor. Revenge had been sweet in its exposure, but it was the power I craved, the slow, architectural remaking of what was to come. I had not only taken the stage, I had begun to change the script. My brother approached me one evening, voice small and away from the ears of the house, asking for a conversation that wasn't about the public fallout. He wanted to plead, to bargain, to remind me of our childhood, of the small crimes and secret alliances we had shared. I listened. He stammered apologies, but apologies, in the world I now inhabited, were currency only when invested into actions. He offered to step away, to sell his shares, to make restitution. The board had already started asking questions about his role. Liquidation had become an inevitability. "You should have asked me before you did it," I said finally, not because I expected him to be contrite but to trace the line of intent that had made his act public. "But you didn't. You made it about you." He lowered his head. "I thought I was protecting you," he said, the absurdity of the line making me want to laugh and cry at the same time. "Protecting me?" I echoed. "No. You protected yourself. And you used other people for cover." We both knew, in that moment, that whatever familial thread still bound us had been thinned to a hair. What remained was a functional civility, calls about practical issues, notes about shared properties, and public courtesies. The intimacy was expatriated. Over the weeks that followed, as I shepherded the company through the procedural cleaning and the board moved to fortify confidence among stakeholders, I felt the intoxicating, lonely taste of authority. Power requires solitude, it demands distance. People will rally behind a leader in crisis because they are desperate for stability, but they will never love the person who destabilized their illusions. Sometimes I wondered if I had wanted too much. Had I cut the cord so wide that nothing of the old life could remain? I saw her once, standing alone in an upstairs window, looking small against the evening sky. The image held no comfort. Betrayal had been avenged, and power had been won, but the heart of the house had been altered irrevocably. Power has a cost, and by taking it, I had begun to pay. It was a price I had been prepared to meet. I had taken the stage, and now the role was mine, steady, strategic, feared by some and respected by others. The empire needed a face, and a face I provided. But in the quiet that followed the storm, as I sat alone in my office late into the night, I felt the long echo of what I had said in motion, the echo of broken trust, the shuffle of alliances, and the knowledge that rebuilding would require not just strength, but a humility I had not yet earned. I closed my laptop and looked at the framed photo on my desk. Not the one that had started all this, but an older black and white image of my father at his desk, hands clasped around a cigarette, eyes fixed on a ledger. Power had never been simple for him either. I realized then that revenge is less a finite moment and more a careful rearrangement of forces. What I had done on the wedding day was explosive, yes, but the true work was in the slow, often dull engineering, rewriting contracts, reshuffling titles, earning the small daily nods that make authority durable. The power struggle within our family had shifted, but it had not ended. It had become, in many ways, a new beginning, an era in which I would not only veto mistakes but also be forced to confront my own capacity for cruelty. I had won a round that mattered, but the war for legacy and the quiet negotiations that follow trauma would require far more than spectacle. They required restraint, wisdom, and, perhaps most dangerously, the willingness to be vulnerable. That, I did not yet know how to do. For now, I would keep building. I would keep consolidating. And I would keep watching, because in power, the only failure more damning than losing is mistaking the high of triumph for the end of the game. The morning after the wedding was strangely quiet. No celebratory brunches, no laughter spilling into hallways, no clinking of champagne glasses. Just silence, heavy and suffocating, as though the house itself was trying to process the carnage I had unleashed. I woke to the sound of distant murmurs in the kitchen, me parents arguing in hushed voices, the kind that carry more venom than shouting. They weren't only discussing the humiliation, they were calculating damage. Damage to the family name, to the company, to the web of alliances they had spent decades nurturing. I knew them well enough to understand they would not waste much time sympathizing with me as the betrayed groom. Their grief was not sentimental, it was political. That suited me just fine. Sympathy was not what I wanted. Control was. When I entered the kitchen, the conversation died instantly. My mother's eyes darted to mine, full of a mixture of pity and fear. My father leaned on the counter, jaw tight, every inch of him radiating anger, but not at me. He was furious at the situation, furious at the cracks that had been exposed under his reign. He didn't speak to me directly. Instead, he muttered to my mother, "We can't let this spiral any further." I sat down at the table and poured myself a cup of coffee, deliberately calm. "It already has spiraled," I said. "What matters now is who takes responsibility for cleaning it up." His gaze snapped to me, sharp and assessing. For a moment, I wondered if he'd accuse me of orchestrating too much, of turning a personal betrayal into a public spectacle. But he didn't. Instead, he nodded once, stiffly, as if acknowledging that I was no longer merely a son now, I was a contender. The fallout was swift and merciless. By the end of the week, articles had surfaced online. Someone, maybe a guest, maybe one of the staff, had leaked the photo from the reception. It spread like wildfire, carried by gossip blogs and whispered about in industry circles. The story was too irresistible: a high-profile wedding imploded by betrayal between siblings, the bride abandoning the groom for the brother. Headlines feasted on it. Betrayal at the altar. The wedding that turned into a corporate earthquake. Reporters dug into every angle: my fiancé's background, my brother's role in the company, even my own history of leadership. Photos of me standing at the altar with that expressionless calm began circulating as memes, captions like, "When you know but you're 2 steps ahead," stamped across my face. For her, the humiliation was catastrophic. She had built her identity around being admired, envied, wanted. Now, she was the subject of ridicule and disdain. Invitations to social events dried up. Friends stopped returning her calls. The same women who used to compliment her dress choices now whispered about her betrayal in bathrooms and behind glowing phone screens. My brother fared no better. He had imagined himself sliding seamlessly into a position of power by attaching himself to her, thinking the spectacle would somehow validate him. Instead, the board was now circling him like vultures, dissecting his judgment, his reliability, his ability to separate personal indulgence from professional responsibility. Every time he entered a room, I could feel the shift in energy. People regarded him not as an equal, but as a liability. I had orchestrated the humiliation, yes. But it was the weight of their own choices that was now crushing them. Still, revenge is a dangerous fire. It consumes, and sometimes, it burns more than you intend. I found myself sitting in my office late at night, long after the house was asleep, staring at documents I had already read 100 times. Succession plans, board memos, financial projections. They blurred together until they no longer looked like numbers but like prison bars. I had achieved what I wanted, the narrative was mine, the control was shifting in my favor, and they were broken. Yet, I couldn't shake the emptiness gnawing at me. I thought unmasking them would give me peace, that watching them fall would heal the wound. Instead, it left me with silence. One evening, my mother came into my office. She closed the door behind her and stood for a moment, watching me the way mothers do when they're trying to read their child's soul. "You've won," she said softly. "But at what cost?" I looked up from my papers. "Would you have preferred I stayed silent? Let them walk all over me? Let him take everything?" Her face tightened. "I'm not saying you were wrong. I'm asking if this," she gestured to the documents, "the late-night obsession, the hard edge in my voice, is worth the man you're becoming." I didn't answer. Because in truth, I didn't know. Meanwhile, my brother grew desperate. He began reaching out to allies, trying to rebuild what he had lost. I caught wind of quiet dinners, backroom conversations, even attempts to woo investors with promises that he was still a viable successor. It was pathetic watching him scramble, clinging to scraps of influence as though they would stitch together his credibility. But desperation breeds recklessness, and recklessness can be dangerous. One evening, he cornered me in the driveway. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, as though he hadn't slept in days. "You think you've won," he spat, his voice shaking. "But you don't understand what you've done. You've poisoned everything." I stared at him, unflinching. "I didn't poison it. You did. You and her. All I did was show everyone the truth." He stepped closer, his fists clenched. For a moment, I thought he might actually hit me. But then his shoulders slumped, and his voice broke. "She's gone. She won't even look at me. Do you know what that feels like?" I let the silence stretch before replying. "Do you know what it felt like for me? To see the two of you together?" His mouth opened, then closed. He had no answer. As he turned and walked away, shoulders sagging, I realized something: I hadn't just taken his pride. I had taken his future. But the higher I climbed, the more unstable the ground beneath me became. Power is never secure, it is borrowed, temporary, conditional. The board that supported me today could turn on me tomorrow if I gave them a reason. Investors who hailed me as the savior could discard me the moment I faltered. So I worked harder. Longer. I became consumed with the company, with fortifying every weakness, with ensuring no betrayal could ever destabilize me again. And yet, late at night, when the office was silent and my reflection stared back at me from the darkened window, I sometimes wondered if I had betrayed myself in the process. Because revenge had given me power. But it had also taken something I wasn't sure I could ever get back. They say power reveals character. What they never tell you is how loudly it echoes back at night. After the board consolidated its confidence in me, I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. What followed was not a single counterstroke but a slow siege, a campaign orchestrated by rivals who smelled blood and by a brother who refused to be written off as collateral. The fallout from the wedding had burrowed into places I hadn't accounted for, into legal corridors, social media trenches, and the private, quiet conversations of people who like to pull strings behind the scenes. The first sign came in the form of a lawyer's letter that arrived on a rainy Thursday, slick envelope stamped with an address I knew too well. My assistant slid it across my desk without looking me in the eye. The clerk at the front desk had gone pale, the hallways hummed with a rumor that a lawsuit had been threatened. I opened the letter with my pen poised like a scalpel. It was a cease and desist served on behalf of my brother and the woman. The accusation was broad and oddly theatrical: defamation, emotional distress, invasion of privacy. They claimed that the public exposure of the photograph at the wedding was orchestrated with malicious intent and had inflicted irreparable harm. They demanded retraction, public apology, and reparations. I read it twice. I knew there was truth in their rage. Of course, no rationalization could make the exposure less painful for those on the receiving end. But the claim that I had orchestrated malicious intent was a convenient narrative for them to buy sympathy, and sympathy could sway investors, judges, and public opinion. It was a gambit meant to muddy the waters. I called our legal counsel and instructed him to respond with measured contempt. We will defend this as a corporate necessity, I told him. It was disclosure in the interest of governance. There's a clear line between private life and corporate risk, and that line was crossed. He agreed. He also warned me, lawsuits bleed resources and time, and reputational fights attract vultures. Already, a rival executive who had been waiting for a chance to move against us began making quiet calls. Those calls turned into whispers. Confidential documents, old contracts, minor irregularities that had been long patched began to appear on anonymous blogs. Someone had left a door open, someone had collected crumbs and turned them into headlines. The board started asking awkward questions at meetings. Investors who had once praised my decisiveness started asking for audits. The apparatus of power I had built to secure me seemed to rattle under the weight of attention I had drawn. At the same time, my brother was not content with legal theatrics. He was rebuilding coalitions. He reached out to allies in other departments, people who had been marginalized under our father's leadership, promising them positions, influence, the chance to be seen as players rather than props. He flattered their grievances into purpose. He promised loyalty in a way I had never done. His voice was desperate and persuasive. People like to back a comeback, they like to be on the side of redemption. I had to be faster. When he launched his public counteroffensive, it wasn't dramatic. He didn't storm the boardroom or shout in interviews. Instead, he fed controlled leaks about my decisions, about delays in projects, about an allegedly nepotistic hiring I had approved, about a supposedly mismanaged account. The leaks were precise, surgical. They were timed to create doubt, doubts about my competence, doubts about whether my ascension had been bought rather than earned. The press devoured it. Opinion pieces appeared arguing that I had weaponized a private matter to seize corporate power. Columnists who had once sung my praise began to write about the fragility of family businesses and how personal vendettas could fracture them. The narrative shifted in subtle ways until it felt like the room had turned on me. The momentum of public sentiment is a strange thing, it moves like a tide, indifferent to nuance. The board convened emergency sessions. I prepared for each with the same clinical precision I had used in the wedding exposed, but something inside me had started to fray. The pressure was no longer only external, it was internal as well. I found myself second-guessing the moves I had once made with icy conviction. Each decision now had a ghost attached to it. What if this is the step that topples everything? What if I am the one who destroys the structure I promised to protect? At home, the atmosphere had calcified. My parents retreated into their routines, my father back to his ledger, my mother to errands that kept her visibly busy. But the distance between us had a new, colder edge. My mother would visit the office under the pretense of support and then return with eyes that had been measuring me in a way I hated. My father, who had once nodded encouragement at my plans, began to ask for more documentation, more oversight. It was the agonizing feeling of being loved conditionally. Then came the betrayal I hadn't anticipated. One of my closest advisors, the PR strategist who had helped craft the messaging around the exposure, began to hedge his bets. He'd been valuable when the camera lights were on, but when the smear campaigns and lawsuits started, he called for moderation. You can't keep pushing in the same aggressive way, he told me, voice cautious. Now it looks like you're running the show for power, not for the company. That's a narrative problem. It was a soft and practical critique, but in that moment it felt like treason. He wanted to pivot, to issue conciliatory statements, to apologize in a way that would calm the waters. I, who had built the machine around decisive exposure, wanted the opposite. I wanted to stand firm. We argued until the office, or rather, my office, which had become the theater of tension, felt like a battlefield. You don't get to rewrite the rules now that the rules don't benefit you, I told him. We needed that exposure to test loyalties. If we back down now, we lose everything. He shook his head. Or you escalate into something that makes you look unprincipled. You're not just fighting your brother, you're fighting perception. There's a difference. I saw the truth in his words like a blade. He was right. But the problem with being right is that it doesn't always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like a new, colder obligation. You realize you can lose not only the battle but also the mirror you used to justify your choices. On a rain-swept afternoon, my brother made a move that changed the tenor of the war. He approached a small consortium of veteran investors who had been critical of our family's conservative strategy. He painted himself as the reformer, the one who would modernize the firm, the one who could bring in fresh capital and new ideas. He was offering them a narrative of redemption and the chance to be part of a comeback. For investors who grew bored with legacy systems. That narrative was intoxicating. The consortium sent a delegation to meet with the board, unofficially at first. They asked for audits, transparency, and for an external review of leadership. In business parlance, they wanted checks and balances. In practice, they were reintroducing friction into the gears I had been smoothing. I watched as the board grew fractious. Each meeting saw factions emerge, some loyal to continuity, some curious about reinvigoration. My influence became contingent on my ability to convince people that I was not only competent but also principled. At night, sleep became a fragile commodity. I started waking in the middle of the night, heart pounding, replaying meetings like a broken film. Once, I dreamed I was back at the altar, but the room was full of faces I didn't recognize and cameras flashed like cold stars. I woke up with the taste of metal in my mouth. It was a sense of vertigo, the sensation of being on a summit where the wind could knock you off at any moment. The pressure manifested elsewhere. Small mistakes that would once be forgivable now became liabilities. A delayed contract signature here, an email sent to the wrong distribution list there, each felt like a crack widening. I became hypervigilant. I double-checked everything, triple-checked contingency plans, and yet the sense that something would erupt unexpectedly never left me. My brother, sensing this, shifted tactics. He began to play the sympathy card more honestly. He attended charity events with an earnestness that seemed to leak through the public resentment. He posted images of solitary walks, captioned with introspective lines about family and healing. People ate it up. In a ruthless way, he was crafting his comeback with the finesse of someone who understood human appetite for stories of redemption. And yet behind the scenes, there were uglier currents. A smear campaign began whispering insinuations about my private life, about decisions that suggested greed more than stewardship. Anonymous calls were made to journalists suggesting that my ascent had been paved with backroom deals and the suppression of dissent. It's fascinating how easily a rumor can grow teeth and start to bite. I fought back. I commissioned audits, invited independent review, and pushed for transparency in board minutes. Transparency was a double-edged sword but also my best defense. If I could prove that my decisions were made with the company's health in mind, then the moral theater of the wedding could be recontextualized as a necessary, if unfortunate, trigger for reforms. But every time I pushed for transparency, my brother countered with humanity, letters to longtime employees, whispered promises to reinvigorate company culture, and carefully staged public appearances. He was adept at appearing contrite while mobilizing new alliances. It was maddening. The war was no longer about who was right and who was wrong, it had become about optics, timing, and endurance. Then came the moment that nearly undid me. A respected journalist from an industry magazine requested a sit-down interview. I agreed, transparency demands it, and perhaps I believed I could explain the calculus of my decisions in a way that would turn public opinion. The interview began well enough. The journalist asked about governance, about the decisions that followed the wedding, and about my vision for the company. I answered candidly, with the practiced humility of a man who had learned to perform contrition without sounding weak. But then the journalist pushed. He asked about my personal motives, whether my exposure of the photograph had been, in part, driven by ambition. It was a fair question, albeit uncomfortable. I started to answer, and in the telling, something in me shifted. I did not feel the neat moral clarity I had once felt when I first planned the reveal. The journalist's gaze was steady, patient, and not at all cruel. He held up a mirror I had not wanted to see. Yes, I heard myself say, before I stopped it. I realized with a pang that the words were true in part. Yes, ambition had been a factor. Maybe it had always been. I tried to reframe it, to speak of stewardship and responsibility, but the seed had been planted. That admission, however small, provided a crack for my brother's lawyers and my adversaries. The journalist didn't print the confession as a sensationalist headline, but the exchange leaked. In days, opinion pieces parsed my admission as an ethical lapse. I had weaponized a personal betrayal to evict a rival and seize control. Board members who had been wavering used it as justification to demand more oversight. Investors called for emergency sessions. My father, who had been my silent ally, sat across from me at dinner and asked, in a voice small and tired, whether I had truly thought about the consequences of using our family wounds as public currency. That night, I walked the house alone. The place felt enormous and empty, like a ship after the crew had abandoned it. I stood by the window and watched the lights of the city blink in the rain. My reflection stared back at me and looked older than it had a year ago. Power, I discovered, is not a static prize you grasp and keep. It is a shifting weather system you have to navigate constantly. The moment you stop, a new front opens. The thrill of victory from the exposure had been replaced by the grind of preservation, endless meetings, constant damage control, and the fragile art of appearing both decisive and humane. I felt the strain in my body, a cold knot that lurked behind my sternum. I had never been physically ill for more than a day or two, but now I found my stomach rebelling, sleep becoming a rarer commodity. I started relying on stimulants to get through the long hours, and coffee stopped tasting like coffee and began to taste like a currency for endurance. Friends began to drift away, unnerved by my intensity or simply afraid of being caught in the crossfire. And yet, in the middle of this erosion, there were victories. We retained key clients. The audits confirmed the worst of the allegations were exaggerations. The board, despite its whispers, reaffirmed support for my interim stewardship reluctantly, but support nonetheless. These wins felt smaller than the pain, but they were real. Power is often a ledger of small, incremental credits. The war of attrition continued. My brother continued to adapt, using softer tactics and building coalitions. I continued to respond with legal firewalls and strategic transparency. Each exchange left a residue of exhaustion. The family dinners became logistical exercises. Conversations with my parents were careful and measured, like negotiations rather than intimacies. Some nights I allowed myself to remember the man I had been before the photograph, before the need for revenge had set me on the path of consolidation. He seemed like a stranger now, someone naive enough to believe in uncomplicated futures. That realization was a quiet ache that sat beneath the sharper pains of board meetings and headline cycles. The battle lines had become clearer. My brother had allies who wanted change and a story of redemption. I had allies who feared chaos and wanted stability. Each side believed in its righteousness. But righteousness is a fragile armor when public opinion and legal challenges can chip away at your image piece by piece. As Part 4 closed on this phase of the conflict, the board scheduled a crucial vote motion to bring in an independent governance advisor with the authority to recommend permanent leadership changes. It was framed as a move for transparency, but in reality it was an inflection point. Depending on the advisor's recommendation, the structure of our leadership, and my role in it, could shift in dramatic ways. I sat in my office the night before the vote, the city hum a distant lullaby, and I let myself for the first time in months feel something that had been buried under strategy and calculation: uncertainty. It was not fear so much as an unmooring. For years I had believed that skill and resolve would be enough. Now I was learning that strategy is only one part of survival, the other part is endurance, emotional, moral, and physical. I thought about my brother having breakfast with a potential investor, about my advisor suggesting conciliatory PR moves, about the lawyer's letter that started the spiral. I thought about the journalist's steady questions and my own offhand admission that ambition had always been a current in my decisions. Outside, rain began to fall again, each drop a cold punctuation on the windowpanes. I realized with dull clarity that the war was shifting into a new phase, one that would require not only tactical cunning but also a confrontation with myself. The coming vote would not just decide the company's future, it would unmask whether I could keep the face I'd forged, or whether the story I had authored would finally catch up and rewrite me. I turned the light off and sat in the dark, listening to the rain, feeling the echo of choices converging. The game had changed. The next move would be decisive, not because of spectacle, but because it would determine who survived the slow, grinding machinery of consequence. And, more quietly, it would determine whether the man who had engineered the fall of others could endure the loneliness of the summit he had fought so hard to reach. The morning of the vote arrived with a strange clarity. The city outside my window was still dripping from last night's storm, streets gleaming like sheets of glass, traffic muted as though the world itself were pausing to watch what would unfold. I woke before dawn, not because of discipline but because sleep had abandoned me long before. My chest carried the familiar knot, but it felt quieter today, more resolved, as if the body had accepted that the outcome was no longer mine to control. The boardroom was prepared like a stage. Long table polished to a mirror sheen, chairs aligned with military precision, water bottles placed at measured intervals. Every member had arrived early, as though punctuality could substitute for neutrality. I walked in last, not out of arrogance but necessity. I needed to see them gathered, to read the room before I took my seat. Their eyes tracked me in silence. Some offered polite nods, some avoided my gaze. The air was thick with rehearsed speeches and concealed loyalties. My brother entered from the opposite door moments later. He looked composed, almost regal in his restraint, a man who had embraced the narrative of redemption so thoroughly that even his silence carried gravitas. Our eyes met briefly. He did not smirk, did not gloat, but the faintest flicker passed through his expression, something between pity and challenge. The chair of the board opened the session with formality, outlining the agenda. The key item, as expected, was the proposal to appoint an independent governance advisor with sweeping authority to review leadership structure and recommend changes including permanent succession. It was cloaked in the language of transparency, but everyone knew this was the battlefield on which our war would either end or transform. The presentations began. First came the consortium of outside investors my brother had courted. They spoke of modernization, global competitiveness, and the dangers of insularity in family-led enterprises. They painted him as a visionary chastened by personal failure, now equipped to lead with humility and innovation. It was a narrative so neatly packaged that even I had to admire the craft. Then it was my turn. I stood, palms pressed to the table, and let silence settle before I spoke. I will not pretend I have been flawless, I began. The admission itself caused a ripple in the room. The events that brought us here, exposures, headlines, and family fractures, were not the ideal path. But they were a necessary one. This company was built on trust, and trust had already been violated long before the photograph appeared. I chose transparency, however brutal, because secrecy corrodes slower but deeper. I stand by that choice. I paced slowly, looking each member in the eye. You are not here to weigh my brother's redemption against my resolve. You are here to decide whether stability or volatility will steer this firm forward. Transparency is not an enemy, it is the foundation of governance. And yes, ambition guided me, but ambition in service of stewardship, not vanity. You know the numbers. You've seen the audits. Whatever narrative swirls outside these walls, inside them we cannot afford to confuse sympathy with strategy. When I sat, the silence was louder than applause. The weight of judgment hung thick. The vote began. One by one, names were called, voices declared. For me. For the motion. Against me. For my brother. It was not unanimous, nor was it expected to be. Each declaration cut deeper than the last, until the tally stood on the edge of equilibrium. A single vote remained. It belonged to my father. The room shifted as all eyes turned to him. He sat at the far end, posture rigid, face unreadable. For months, he had withdrawn into silence, measuring, watching. Now his voice would tip the scales. He cleared his throat. I have spent my life building this institution with discipline and sacrifice. I know what ambition looks like, and I know what recklessness looks like. I also know what betrayal feels like. My sons have embodied all of these things. His eyes flicked to my brother, then to me. The company cannot survive on sentiment. It must survive on governance. I vote. He paused, the silence stretching so long that I thought I could hear my own pulse hammering against my skull. For the motion. The words landed like iron. The motion passed. An independent advisor would be appointed, empowered to restructure leadership. In practice, it meant my authority was clipped. My seat was no longer secure, it was provisional, contingent on someone else's review. My brother did not regain immediate control, but his path was cleared for a potential reinstatement. The board exhaled. The battle was over, at least formally. The war, however, had only changed terrain. I remained seated as others filed out, hand gripping the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles whitened. My father did not look back as he left. My brother passed me, eyes steady, expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might stop, say something, extend the olive branch he had so publicly cultivated. But he didn't. He walked on. When the room emptied, I was alone with the echo of rain still dripping faintly against the windows. The silence pressed down like a verdict. I realized then that power is not stolen once and kept forever, it is borrowed, leased, and judged endlessly. That night, I stood again by the window of my home, city lights shimmering in the distance. The company would continue. My brother would continue. I would continue. But none of us would be untouched. We had carved wounds into each other that no advisor, no investor, no headline could mend. Was it worth it? That question hovered in the glass reflection staring back at me. The man I saw was harder, lonelier, and infinitely more aware of the costs of ambition. Perhaps history would vindicate me, perhaps not. But the truth was simpler: I had made my choices, and they had made me. In the end, it wasn't triumph or defeat that defined me. It was endurance, the ability to stand, rain-soaked and stripped of certainty, and still claim my place in the storm. And as I turned from the window, I knew one thing with absolute clarity: this was not an ending. It was only the latest beginning in a life where power and consequence would always walk side by side.